Excellent. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming along. My name's Dan Pietersen, and this is a talk from Romancing the Gothic about haunted houses in video games. I'm going to be going back through time, through 4 decades of video gaming, and how haunted houses have been always important to games, and how they let us think about both gaming and the Gothic itself. So we've got our intro screen there, ready to play the game. First up is my Twitter handle. That's Peter Sender. If you want to follow me on Twitter or follow up anything that I mentioned in the talk, then you're more than welcome to. Always good to have a chat. There. And there I am in glorious 4K, coming on and promptly walking away. One of the characters that we'll see later on when I start talking about the games. The Romancing the Gothic hashtag is there, so if you want to tweet along with the talk, or want to follow anything up, please use that, and that will show where the talk's coming from. But you need to get into the game itself. Unfortunately, because we're going back to the 1980s, we first have to wait for the game to load, which anybody who is as old as me will remember that can take some time. But it lets us do a bit of admin first of all. So first of all, content warnings. I've said we don't really have any content warnings for this talk. It's about games, it's about horror games largely. So there are some zombies, monsters, death, things like that, but they are in general terms and they are related to games themselves. The only thing I can really think of is there is a mention of eugenics in a gaming sense. One of the baddies in one of the games is a eugenicist. So that's, bear that in mind. But again, it's in general terms, the concept rather than any specifics. Spoiler warnings, however, we do have a couple of them. There are spoiler warnings for 4 main games that I'm going to be talking about. These are the sort of case studies that I will be using. So we have Jet Set Willy from the 80s, Castlevania, Resident Evil, and then Control from the 2010s. The spoilers are more about what the games are about. There aren't any really specific end game concerns apart from maybe Castlevania. But again, that's from the 90s. So if you haven't played it by now, it's too late, sorry. So there isn't a huge amount, I don't think, to really worry about. Hopefully you can just sit back and enjoy the rest of the talk. And that's long enough to load it up, which is good. So as a kind of introduction, I'm going to go through why am I choosing 4 decades. 40 years is a long period of time. It goes back into the 80s, which is quite frightening. But there's a number of reasons why I'm starting there and then why I'm going along in decade periods. The first is that I think that the 80s, it kind of is, it's a bit nostalgic and it's a bit looking back, but the 1980s were, for people like me, a golden age of gaming. It moved video gaming from the arcade into the home. Systems like the ZX81 and then the ZX Spectrum, both from the Sinclair company, were, for the time, affordable and portable computers that you could have in your home. And a number of people in my school managed to convince their parents to get them a computer because it would help them with their homework. They weren't just gaming systems. You could also do things like spreadsheets and word processing on them. If any child actually did do word processing or spreadsheets on the ZX Spectrum, I would be surprised, but that's one of the reasons why we got them. And it's a classic computer. I think it's still, in design sense, this black, very 80s looking device with its admittedly rather strange keys, which one reviewer described like feeling like dead flesh, the strange rubberized keys. But it was a step up from previous opportunities for playing games in your own home. Later in the year, we got the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, or the NES, which was a dedicated console, so purely for playing games. This was a much more reliable system. The Sinclair used cassette tapes to play games, and notoriously those cassette tapes could degrade and you would start losing the ability to play the games, which was an amazing frustration a lot of the time. Cartridges are much more reliable and durable, and it stood up to the rigors of kids wanting to play games on it. And you got there Super Mario Brothers, obviously one of the very famous game and one that still lingers around today with different versions. But trouble was brewing. And later on in the 1980s, you got the Master System from Sega. And right at the end, you got the Genesis, which was released in Europe at the start of the 90s as the Mega Drive. So you probably maybe know it more from that name. And that started off effectively a console war between Nintendo and Sega. And as the 80s progressed into the 90s, that got fairly aggressive. The advert campaigns like here were actively fighting against each other. Sega specifically tried to go more for the kind of cool, edgy advertising. Sonic the Hedgehog is a much more literally spiky character than Super Mario is. And that progressed on through the 90s, probably until we had the PlayStation, which allied itself very much with dance music and club scenes, which again, an interesting cultural crossover. So those are the main systems from the 80s. It kind of brings a tear to my eye to go back and talk to them. I remember the Mega Drive I had, the Spectrum that I had back when I was a wee lad. And that's my second reason, really, for going back to the 80s. I was born at the end of the 70s, but very much grew up through the 80s. So you can see me there in all my very trendy splendor, with my NHS glasses and haircut even worse than the one I have today, which is bizarre. But if you look on the left-hand side of that screen, you can see that ZX Spectrum connected by a rather wonky cable to an old black and white TV, I think, originally, in my bedroom in my home in Lancashire in Northern England when I was a young lad. So that's really why I'm going back this far. But as I mentioned before the talk started, I'm going to be choosing 3 games, one of which I'm going to delve into a bit more for each of the decades. So the time should rattle along fairly quickly. But what is a haunted house? Why am I specifically talking about haunted houses? There are many settings for games, many of them less frightening than a haunted house might be. Well, there's a number of reasons, and they come kind of from what they do for games. So the first is that a haunted house is a playground, and I've used a hyphenated version of playground for a reason which will come up later on, and that exists within delineated boundaries. So we have a space that effectively has walls around it, and those walls keep the player inside. It doesn't necessarily have to be a crowded space or a small space. Sometimes the fact that the space is very large can be a way of haunting the player in its own way. And those boundaries can move and shift and change. Some of the more frightening haunted house stories are ones where the boundaries start to shift and start to move and confuse the people who are within it. But ultimately, it is a space that can be defined by walls around it. It's a space then as well that's filled with preternatural and antagonistic entities, and even environments themselves, so traps, and even the house itself may become antagonistic to the player. And I've used preternatural there rather than supernatural because that gives me a bit of a wider view of what those entities might be, things that are beyond our normal understanding of how the world works, not necessarily just some magical creatures or things. And ultimately, where escape or simply survival is an end goal. Every game should really have a goal of some kind, whether that's to finish the game or whether to get better at the game. And that allows us this kind of idea of escape and survival are fairly root causes or root end goals for a player. So I think this makes haunted houses and equivalent things that we could talk of as haunted houses excellent settings for video games, even if the games themselves sometimes aren't that excellent. And that's a screenshot from Haunted House, that Atari game that I had up there for a moment. It's a dreadful, dreadful game. It's barely even a game, really, but it gives us an idea of what gaming can do. The cover pictures, up until relatively recently, were often very, very better than the actual games themselves. And that allows us to think about maybe thinking about the exterior of things. There was often in a haunted house story, the people involved walk up to the house, they see a flickering light that maybe welcomes them in, but that welcome is a bit too double-bladed. And this idea of a haunted house being a game is kind of backed up by some game theory. So I'm going to run through some quotes. These are probably the largest quotes that we've got in the talk today. And the first one is from a book about game design called Rules of Play. And that says that in a very basic sense, the magic circle of a game is where the game takes place. To play a game means entering into a magic circle or perhaps creating one as a game begins. And that phrase, the magic circle, I think is very interesting because it shows that what I was talking about on that previous slide, you have an area to play within. And that area is set aside, set apart from the area from which you've come. And that phrase, the magic circle, isn't something that Taylor and Zimmerman came up with originally. It derives from an older book called Homen Ludens, The Playing Man, by a theorist called Johann Huizinga back in the 1950s. And Huizinga, famously, for people who've been involved in game theory and understanding games, said that all play moves and has its being within a playground, marked off beforehand, either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc. All are in form and function playgrounds, i.e. forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. So for Huizinga then, all these game areas, all these areas where you have the common everyday work, and then you move into a separate space, often by donning a uniform of some kind, if you're thinking about sports games, the football field, and as he says, the tennis court, they are ritual areas where people do special things. Certain rules apply that don't apply in our normal day, and the normal day rules sometimes also don't apply. And that's why I use that idea of playground hyphenated to give a bit more specificity to the word, as it comes from this theory from the philosopher Johann Huizinga. However, we're in the 80s now, and I won't study philosophy for another 20 years when I finally go to university. So we have the door there of Sweet Home, which appears in other later games, but a Nintendo game from 1989, beckoning us in to the haunted houses proper. So we'll start with the 1980s, and we'll start with 1980 at the start of the 1980s with Pac-Man, possibly one of the more famous games. He still appears as either as a guest character in other games or as in new actual Pac-Man games. But the original, the arcade version, is, as I'm sure you're aware, it takes place in a maze, and it's a haunted maze because Pac-Man is chased throughout the game by ghosts. And he's outnumbered by these ghosts, who I'm sure you know are called Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde. Everybody knows that. The ghosts in Pac-Man have names. Those ghosts are interesting because they have their own kind of AI for such an early game. The different ghosts do different things. Some of them just simply chase Pac-Man. Some of them try to intercept Pac-Man. And some of them sometimes run away from Pac-Man, not even when he's powered up through one of his power pills. But the game's aim is very simple, perhaps the most simplistic, in some ways the most pure aim of a video game is to get the highest score. And Pac-Man does that simply by surviving, by avoiding the ghosts. And if he can, by turning the tables on him through the use of those power pills. The second game is one of my favorite games from this early period, which I played a lot on my Spectrum computer, and that's Attic Attack. Again, a game which, its cover is maybe a bit more interesting, although not to the same degree as Haunted House. But Attic Attack is set in a haunted mansion. And throughout the game, various creatures, those little sprites, which is both a technical term for them in the game, but also probably the more correct mythological term for them. These creatures constantly attack the protagonist, who is a little helmeted character in the middle of the screen there. And you have these weird sprites and goblins, but you also have more dangerous characters like vampires, mummies, and ghosts. So very Gothic figures appear throughout this game. You do have a score in Attic Attack, which you can see on the menu there, above the roast chicken, which represents the character's health. Obvious. ZX Spectrum games back in the 80s had a strange sense of humor most of the time. But the true aim of the game is to explore it from its cellars and dungeons up to its attics, to find the three parts of the key that you need to open that main door and to eventually escape this mansion. So those are the first two kind of scene-setting games from the 1980s. But the main one I'm going to talk about today is possibly one of my favorite games ever. Back in 1984, I think it is the game that I'm playing on that photo I put up earlier on. If I squint hard enough, I can sometimes see some of the characters, but that may be more me than the game. Jet Set Willy was released in 1984, and it is an immediate sequel from the game Manic Miner, which features the same character, known as Miner Willy. We'll have no sniggering at the back, that's a perfectly normal name. In Manic Miner, Willy proceeded through a series of screens that depicted him over deepening into a mine, and at the end of it has made his fortune from this work. With his fortune, he buys himself a mansion. He doesn't seem to buy himself new clothes. He still wears these miner boots there, although he does have a tuxedo on, which is an interesting match. But the first thing you do after buying a new house is have a housewarming party. And the more expensive the housewarming party, the more extreme it sometimes gets. And Willy wakes up the day after, finding that his party has got way out of hand and his mansion is now a mess with rubbish scattered all throughout it. And quite rightly, Maria, Willy's newly acquired housekeeper, won't let him go to bed until he has cleaned all of the rubbish. He made the mess, so he has to clean it up, even with the what is implied throbbing hangover that he now has. So simple, quite a good setting for a game. You have to explore a space and you have to collect various items until you can finish it. But overnight, the mansion has turned from what is implied to be quite a large space to a huge and quite literally Gormengastian sprawl of a house. There are ballrooms, ramparts, cellars, but stranger areas that you might not expect a mansion to have. The most weird of them is a portal to the underworld. And beyond even this, it's been infested with strange monsters and traps that kill Willy simply by touching him. And he has no way to defend himself. He has no weapons. He simply has to avoid these monsters as they, in a weird ghost-like way, do these repetitive movements back and forth, completely oblivious largely to Willy as he walks around, but equally deadly. And another strange twist is that Jet Set Willy can't be finished, even if you manage to collect all of these pieces of rubbish. There is a bug in the game, in the original release of the game, that means that one of the rooms in itself becomes deadly to Willy. This was explained away once it was discovered as the room becoming filled with poison gas, but it is a bug, it's not meant to be there. You need to use an early form of patching called a poke to fix the game and be able to play it properly. And that's quite interesting because it looks back to Pac-Man, the original Pac-Man. Once you got to level 256, the game corrupts. It can't take that amount of information, and it is a similar issue to the bug that causes the problems in Jet Set Willy. The game gets overloaded and starts to corrupt. So if you get to the end of Pac-Man, you leave Pac-Man trapped forever in this corrupted space with weird flickering ghosts, which are slightly stranger than the ones that he's encountered already. And these strange quirks of Jet Set Willy led in playgrounds around the country, actual school playgrounds in this sense, not magical ones, becoming haunted by different rumors that circulated about the game. The main one of the ones that I remember, is that if you did certain things in certain rooms, something that will become quite popular in later games, secrets to be uncovered, but if you went to a certain room at a certain time in the game or a certain time in real life, then certain things would happen. The main one is that if you went to the screen that involves Willy's yacht, obviously he's a millionaire, he has a yacht. If you went there at a certain time, the yacht would unmoor itself and head to a new room, a secret room. There was also rumors around the codes that were in the copy protection for the game. It was one of the first games I remember that had copy protection, because a tape can simply be dubbed in a stereo, so it was very easy to copy and share games. And that screen at the bottom right, that very weirdly colored graph, is the copy protection. You'd be asked at the start of the game to enter the code from, say, K3, and you would have to enter in the 4 colors that were there. There were rumors that were going around that if you use certain of those codes at certain times, then again, that would do certain things. Maybe you'd get infinite lives. Maybe you would remove all of the enemies in the screen. And I remember lots of kids trying this over and over again, but none of it was true. You can look in the code of the game and none of this really applies. But that doesn't really matter to rumors, because once a rumor starts up, then they exist and they persist as long as people keep repeating them. And again, they become ghostly in their own way. They have an existence which is not an existence. It is a strange suspension of how things actually work. And that then, I think, this early game is one of the reasons why haunted houses, not just because of their applicability, the way that they are a delineated space, the way that they have monsters, the way that they have a goal, but in large ways, this game itself made haunted houses an obsession of video games. I'd be surprised if there are many developers who haven't played this or haven't actually at least aware of it. But this game, and specifically this level, this nightmare room, still lingers in my imagination whenever I play games. And I go back to it. So you can play it online now in a browser if you want to travel back into the weird world of 1980s gaming. But the 1980s inevitably turned into the 1990s, and games started to advance slightly. Home PCs, Windows PCs largely, became more prevalent, and as things do, time advanced. So I'm going to talk briefly about two more games and another case study. And the first one is Alone in the Dark, the original Alone in the Dark. And this, again, similar, repeated themes. You have gone to a haunted mansion. In this game, it's to explore rumors of a haunting, literally of a haunting, which becomes something slightly darker, as it says in the tagline there at the bottom, that this game is inspired by the work of H.P. Lovecraft. So things get strange. They also get slightly racist, as they would do in most Lovecraft-inspired things, but we'll ignore that for now. But the aim is to escape. You find yourself trapped in a haunted mansion. You have to go through various traps and perils and try to escape. And it's also often cited as an early example of what's now called survival horror. So other games that we might talk about later on, but things like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, a number of other games have this survival horror tag. And that often means that you are threatened. The enemies are deadly to you. They're not just bullet sponges that can be killed. And you don't have, you have limited supplies. Ammo, health, those kind of things are in limited supply. And that very much applies to Alone in the Dark, where you are simply a Victorian writer thrown into this strange environment. But one thing that Alone in the Dark did, and it's not the first to have done this, but it does it quite well, is that it not only has 3D environments that you can walk around, not the 2D side-on environments of Jet Set Willy, or the top-down environment of Attic Attack, but you can explore, you can open wardrobes, try and find items, and you can also defend yourself against the creatures. There we have one of the two choosable characters, about, hopefully, to take out that zombie who's just walked in the room. But the fixed camera angle, often from the corner of a room, makes the area look quite weird. We'll see this come up again. Other games do use it. But for the time, it looks quite blocky now, quite pixelated. But at the time, this was mind-blowing, largely. You could interact with the world rather than just walk around it. You could push wardrobes in front of doors. You can open windows to pounce on enemies and push them out. So this is literally a haunted house. It's explicitly a haunted house, but it does new things from the games that were before. And then we move on in the middle of the 1990s to System Shock. And this is a sci-fi game set aboard a space station in the year 2072, which in the 90s felt like it was very, very far away. Now we're in 2022, perhaps not so far away. And this is interesting because I think there's often a separation between sci-fi and other genres. If it's in space, on a space station, then it has to be sci-fi. But I think it can also be horror, it can also be Gothic, it can also be a haunted house. There's a game later on, which I'll talk about, which I think is an archetypal haunted house set in space. And this setting is haunted not by ghosts, not by zombies or skeletons, but by an artificial intelligence called Shodan. And in some ways, she's more frightening. She is a kind of ghost, but she is self-aware, she is sentient, and she inhabits the entirety of the space station. So no matter where you are, she is aware of you and she can threaten you. And also interesting, this is a non-linear game. So rather than the previous games that we've sometimes seen where you have a goal and you move through different steps to gain that, achieve that goal, in System Shock, you can explore wherever you like. There are some locked off areas, but you acquire the key, you can get in there. The only thing that really stops you is that the power of some of the enemies that you might find could be too much for you. You have to find your way around. But you explore this ship, you develop your skills, you improve your equipment, and hopefully, eventually, you defeat Shodan. At least until 2114, when System Shock 2 is set, and it's revealed that Shodan did not die, but like all the best baddies, like all the best undead, has come back again to threaten not only you this time, but the galaxy as a whole. System Shock 2 is possibly one of the best games ever made. I say that without threat of being contradicted. It is a terrifying game. There are things in this that I still find frightening. If you play it back through, the graphics haven't really, don't really stand the test of time. There are some patches and mods you can get to bring it up to date. But the narrative and the way that it's played out, and how Shodan as a character, this rogue AI, this kind of very archetypal sci-fi figure, is terrifying. I think it's easy to say. Very good game, and if you can play it, have a go if you haven't already. But the archetypal case study I'm going to look at for the 1990s is Castlevania, and specifically Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which was released in 1997 for the PlayStation. Again, one of my favorite games. It's a game I still like to go back and play now. It's available on modern platforms as remake versions. This, again, continues this kind of non-linear exploration-focused gameplay. You can explore the castle, Dracula's castle, and you can gain new skills. You can try and do it without gaining these skills, which is possible, but difficult. But as you get more powerful and regain various abilities, it becomes easier to progress through the game. And as a kind of aside, this kind of exploration focus, this non-linear game, became known as Metroidvania style. Metroid is another sci-fi based game which does the same kind of thing. You're often given an area which you explore. You can get further into the game by gaining new skills. But this is where I'm going to start talking about how games kind of interact with the Gothic. And I think Castlevania and a number of other games use the Gothic idea of the double and of doubling. Castlevania is a large series of games. There is probably, I think, more than 20 Castlevania games. And Symphony of the Night is a direct sequel to the previous game called Rondo of Blood. And when they're repackaged, they're often repackaged together so you can play them one after the other. So the idea of sequels and series is a very basic view of the idea of the double. But Castlevania introduces a new character, Alucard, a half vampire and the son, as we eventually find out, of Dracula. The eagle-eyed amongst you may notice that Alucard is Dracula backwards. Ah, a clue. So Alucard is the player character, the protagonist of the game, and he arrives at Dracula's castle, trying to find out what's happened to the castle, which as it does, disappears and comes back again. At the start of the game, and this is a thing that's kind of repeated through a lot of the Castlevania games, Alucard is very powerful, and you basically go through enemies like a hot knife through butter. But he's captured, and his skills are removed from him, and his abilities and his equipment. So a lot of the game is spent on rebuilding the character of Alucard, so that he can get to the end of the game and defeat the final boss. And again, like Jet Set Willie's mansion, Dracula's castle in Symphony of the Night is huge. There's a map of it there. You can go down into deep, dank cellars. You can climb towers and belfries. You can explore ballrooms and kitchens. But every room, almost, apart from the handful of safe rooms where you save the game, are filled with various creatures, from lowly skeletons and zombies up to demons and even death himself in certain areas. And all of them, fairly mindlessly, want to kill Alucard. So the aim of the game is to start at the gateway, explore the castle, get better, get more powerful, find better equipment, and head up to the throne room at the top of the castle and kill the final boss, ending the game. And the final boss, this is a spoiler, one of the few major spoilers for the games, the final boss is actually the protagonist of the previous game, which is an interesting twist. So you, as a half vampire, are set against the purely human protagonist of the previous game. An interesting flip. But at least that's what the game tells us to start with. Symphony of the Night is a surprising game, a startling game, because that part of the game is only half of it. Unlike Jet Set Willy, there are rumours that if you did certain things at certain times, in certain places, then you would reveal new secrets of the game. And you do. If you encounter certain people and they give you certain items, you go to certain areas and use them, you can find out that the final boss is not actually the final boss. He's been manipulated by something higher and more evil. If you do this and defeat that actual power, there's a cutscene, a very famous cutscene, where it reveals that there is an entirely new castle, inverted, hidden, floating above the one you've already explored. Even though in your status screen, it says that you've explored 100% of the castle, you can now explore it to 200.6% of the castle. And this time, when you finally work your way up through this eerily swapped and doubled castle that is inverted, you have to climb up the back of stairs, you have to do various things to get around, use your now found abilities to turn into a bat, for example. You then find Dracula himself at the end of this inverted castle and defeat him. But if you don't do this, and you just play the game as it's supposedly supposed to be played, you can complete it, you can think you've done everything, never finding this entirely new game, which is basically makes it twice as long. So that, I think, is an example of how doubling is used by games and how we use it to shock, to add to the enjoyment, and to make those games better. And doubling is used throughout video games, again, in sometimes shocking and strange ways. Early games, and even games now, when we have lots of processing power, try to make the most out of that processing power and that storage. One of the things that you can do is a thing called a palette swap. So that uses the same image, changes the color, makes it into something different. This happens a lot in games like Mortal Kombat, where characters have different uniforms. And it happens in early games when you have lots of similar monsters, just change the color and they look different. One of the weirdest, perhaps, and one of the ones that if you've played these games for a long time might make you stand back, is that in Super Mario Brothers, the clouds are trees and bushes. If you take a cloud image, make it green and put it down on the ground, it becomes a bush. And there's something a bit eerie about that when you realize that. It makes the game world a stranger place. You cannot unsee the cloudy bushes. But equally, there's a more deeper doubling in the fact that the player and the character that the player plays are separate things, but they could become blended. And the world that you play in is a different world from the world that we know. It can be very different, it can be impossible, but it can also bleed in. In Metal Gear Solid, which is down there at the bottom right, released at near the end of the 1990s, you have a character called Psycho Mantis, a psychic assassin who you have to fight as an end-of-level boss. Psycho Mantis is fully aware that he is in a game and he is a character. He talks to you directly as the player. He sometimes, if you have save games on the PlayStation that you're using it on, he mocks the fact that you haven't got very far in games like Castlevania and other games. But he also tells you things like puts your controller on the floor. And I remember playing this and being deeply chilled by the fact that a character in the game was not only talking to me as a player, not as a character, but threatening me. There are various things you have to do to defeat Psycho Mantis. He turns the sound down on your TV. He makes you have to use the world that you exist in as a player rather than as a character to defeat it. And it's quite a frightening, but quite an interesting way of changing how games work. And then you also have doubling outside of video games. Anyone who's watched the recent Castlevania Netflix animation will probably recognize the story of Castlevania Symphony of the Night quite immediately. It's taken a lot from the game to build up the show. And a lot of that is probably the modern sort of referencing back, Easter eggs and things like that. But it is equally an interesting story. The distrust between humans and half vampires and monsters. And obviously the inevitable Gothic question of who is the monster. But now we're going to the 2000s, almost back to modern day. And I'm going to start here with Doom 3, which was a reimagining. They're very careful to say it's not a remake. It's definitely not a sequel of the original Doom, which came out in 1993, another archetypal game, one which I think changed the face of gaming forever. And in Doom, you have to fight your way through a Martian base and its various offshoots areas, and then to hell itself. And if you can think of a better haunted house than hell, I'd be interested to see what that might be. But Doom 3 is interesting because although the original Doom and its immediate sequels were just shooters, the first-person shooters, and the aim was to shoot your way through monsters to get to the end of the level. Doom 3, perhaps not entirely successfully, and it was quite criticised when it first came out, prioritised atmosphere over simple action. There is a lot of shooting, there is a lot of killing monsters, but equally there is a lot of creeping around dimly lit space station interiors, wielding only a flashlight. One of the main criticisms, and perhaps an understandable one, is that your highly trained space marine couldn't hold a gun and a torch at the same time. But for game reasons, I think it's well done. It is largely built up with jump scares, and in some ways to have that be effective, you can't see it coming. If you go back and play Doom 3 now, without the kind of prejudice of expecting it to be a shooter, there are some really, really scary moments in this. There are things that you can easily miss. There are bloody footprints appear in corridors, and if you follow them, sometimes you see the ghosts that made them. Nothing to do really with the game, but certainly a very atmospheric and involving piece of art. And then moving from the far future of Mars, you get a game called Thief, Deadly Shadows, which was the third, effectively, in the Thief series. The first two were much earlier games. And this is kind of interesting because you have an inversion here. You play Garrett, who is a burglar. And in many ways, the burglar is someone who haunts the city that they work within. He works at night. He tries to avoid the people who live in the houses that he is burgling from, but sometimes he has to cause distractions, sometimes he has to take more direct action. And Thief is set in the very, certainly the 2000s, this very Gothic idea of the city. There are a number of narratives where places are just called the city. It relates very strongly influenced, I think, by China Miéville's story sets around Bastalag, this strange steampunk, mystical arena. Everything is often shrouded by fog, within which you can creep and hide. But Thief is not really a haunted house game, but it does have a haunted house level. In one level, which is called Robbing the Cradle, all of the action in Thief is kind of set up into different chapters. Garrett has to go to a thing called the Shalebridge Cradle, an old empty building. It was once an orphanage, and before that it was an asylum, but now it's abandoned and run down after a mysterious fire, which again, if that doesn't ring alarm bells, and anybody who's ever watched any horror film ever, maybe you shouldn't go in. But in the prologue to this chapter, Garrett explains that if there's a way to cram more misery into one building's history, I can't think of it. And Garrett is a supremely confident, arrogant character, largely. He's very good at what he does. And it is this area where he shows fear and he shows concern. And you can see in that small section from the animated cutscene, Garrett himself is hiding from one of the inhabitants of the cradle. It's not something he normally does. And I think that links back to the idea not just of a haunted house, but of a house itself that haunts, a house which has its own sentience and awareness. And as you progress through the Shalebridge Cradle, you find, as in often in games of the 2000s, you build up the story from finding notes and in-game references. And it's revealed that the cradle itself, because of all the misery and horror that's happened within it, has built up its own sentience, its own vengeful sentience. And when it starts to remember you, as in you linger within it too long, or you leave things of your possessions behind, it remembers you and stops you from leaving. And I think that links back. Again, we've got that the screenshot, a face with action happening in the background from The Haunting, the film adaptation of Shirley Jackson's Haunting of Hill House. And the idea then, I think that this moves on, this idea that a house can not just be haunted, but a house can be its own locus of haunting, is a very interesting one, and one that games already are playing with, and we'll see that come up in the final case study, which is next. But first, some of you may have thought, this man's talking about haunted houses, but he hasn't mentioned Resident Evil. What's going on? Well, unfortunately, I've got to the 2000s. Resident Evil was released in '96, so I can't use that. But there's the sequel, Resident Evil 2, possibly, again, one of the best games ever made, certainly one of my favourite games. Resident Evil 2, sadly, was also released in the 90s, in 1998. But with a little bit of sleight of hand and a little bit of game trickery, I can use the remake of Resident Evil, which was made for the GameCube in 2002. And that takes the original game, remakes it, arguably improves upon it. Certainly the graphics are better. It makes some of the puzzles more interesting, makes some of the action more frightening. And the game follows STARS, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service of the Raccoon City Police Department, as they attend an emergency call from the Spencer Mansion. There have been reports of deaths and missing people in the area, and it's accelerated to such a frequency that they need to investigate and find out what's going on. And they do eventually find out what's going on, and I'm sure they regret ever having done it. And I think Resident Evil talks quite nicely about legacy, another concern of the Gothic, how things progress through time, down through families, and how that legacy becomes corrupted and traps people within it. Resident Evil takes a lot from films like Night of the Living Dead, obviously the zombies and barricaded houses. Psycho as well. If you watch Psycho when she heads into the house, there's taxidermy everywhere, and the taxidermy reappears quite threateningly, especially when it's shown in shadows in the house of Resident Evil. But it looks back to previous games. Sweet Home, when we started this talk, when we went into that doorway, very famously, the loading screen from Resident Evil is a door slowly opening. And in Alone in the Dark, it replicates that fixed camera angle with the 3D element. And famously, the shotgun is probably one of the most well-used weapons in gaming, certainly in zombie games. Zombies seem to be allergic to shotguns. But the narrative of Resident Evil, the game and the series, is obsessed in many ways with this idea of legacy and corruption. A zombie's bite passes on this infection of the zombie, whether it be a magical or a scientific rationale for what that is, but it goes deeper. And this is the next slide when I talked about the figure of a eugenicist. That is Oswald Spencer, who built the Spencer Mansion and who is at the very beginning of the Resident Evil legacy of its story. He was a biologist and he had an obsession with eugenics and with the purity of humans. Interestingly, not necessarily from a racial perspective, but from this often evil genius, misguided aim of improving society. And he was founder of the Umbrella Corporation, which should always have an evil stab of keyboards whenever you mention it. But he had this house built, and the Spencer Mansion, which is this kind of very shadowed Gothic area. There are lots of mezzanines, there's huge staircases that lead up, and there are hidden rooms and basements and attics. The mansion eventually becomes overrun with zombies. Eventually they transform or are replaced by other creatures. And as with all good zombie narratives, that's revealed to be due to a virus. The virus, in a kind of, again, a weird doubling, is revealed to be housed in a bioweapons facility under the mansion. I'm sure all of us have a bioweapons facility under our houses. It's become mainstream these days. But I remember playing Resident Evil, first of all, and thinking that all I had to do to finish the game would be to escape the mansion. And I laugh now when I think about that, because when you escape the mansion, you end up in somewhere far worse, this terrifying, overrun bioweapons facility. And also, I think Resident Evil has a nod to this idea of legacy and this progression of ideas and of corruption, in that most of the puzzles that you encounter, and Resident Evil's often, certainly early days, were very much involved in solving puzzles, revolve around heirlooms and artifacts. You always have to find a seal or some kind of, like this image here, a shield that needs to be replaced or needs to be swapped to open a secret door or to disarm a trap. And again, I think this idea of legacy, these playgrounds of games, allow us to talk about legacy, the idea of legacy, and to also interrogate it and to interrupt it. We can play games and we can see terrible things happen within games, quite safe in the knowledge that they are just games. There are modern day games where you can witness nuclear war or terrible acts of violence. And then we can turn the game off and we can think that was horrible. I hope it never happens. We can even, if we want to, perform these acts ourselves, and in strange and different ways. We can walk around a level killing everybody. We can even kill characters that aren't meant to be killed. Or we can do slightly stranger things, like in the notoriously terrifying game Roller Coaster Tycoon 2, which came out in 2002. We can build roller coasters that are more than they should be. Mr. Bones' Wild Ride, which is the screenshot there in the bottom right, is a roller coaster that was built by a Reddit user in Roller Coaster Tycoon. The game takes the ride takes 4 in-game years to traverse. It's very slow and very long. And because of some interesting use of entry signs and routing, once one of the little characters in Roller Coaster Tycoon has boarded Mr. Bones' Wild Ride, they can never get off it and simply go around and around and around. And because these little figures don't really need to eat or drink, they don't die of old age, they are trapped there forever. And the ride, as it says in the sign, never ends. But we can also challenge the people who do these terrible acts and the acts themselves. We can use games to investigate how we could stop these things from happening. The simplistic way of using the rocket launcher to kill whoever was wanting to do it, or maybe other ways, and discuss other things that we can do. And that moves us into 2010s, the final decade of my 40 years of haunted house games. And the first one that I'm going to talk about very briefly before we get to the final case study is Alien Isolation. And that was released in the middle of the 2010s. And it is effectively not necessarily a direct sequel, but it's in time, it is immediately after the film Alien. And you play Amanda Ripley, who is Ellen Ripley's daughter. She is on a spaceship and she approaches a space station. I can't remember the reason. I think they're just there to refuel or to dock or something. And as inevitably, the poor old Ripley line encounters aliens, almost inevitably so. And things go awry, let's say. And this, I think, brings back the idea of these space-based games. You might not immediately think that a sci-fi game is a haunted house game, but being trapped on a space station, which is damaged and slowly collapsing, not only gives us this peril and claustrophobia, which I think haunted houses often needs to have, but a reason why we can't just leave. You often think sometimes while watching a horror film, it's like the door's there. Why don't you just go and don't go down into the cellar? But if you're on a space station, and you don't have a working spacesuit or you don't have an escape pod, you can't leave. You have to stay and deal with the horrors that you see. But equally, in Alien Isolation, when you do have to go outside into space, hung above a gas giant, or in one key element onto the surface of another planet, that makes it all the more terrifying. You remember how vulnerable you are. Amanda isn't a superhero. She isn't a cartoon character. When she's outside in a spacesuit, she is slow and she is vulnerable. And I think this is another one of my favorite games, there are bits in this that are genuinely terrifying. If you could attach your heart rate, I think, to a monitor while playing this, it would be louder than any motion sensor you could imagine. But the penultimate game in this talk is Bloodborne. While part of the Soulsborne series of games, notorious for their difficulty, for their obscurity, and largely for their sort of open world elements. Bloodborne, I think, though, is interesting because it looks at what haunted houses are. And there are lots of haunted houses in Bloodborne. There are lots of areas you can go into that have these strange creatures and threats within them. But the narrative of Bloodborne asks us what happens when reality becomes haunted. Not when a taloned finger taps on the window of our bedroom, but when it taps on the skin of the place in which we exist. And Bloodborne is very much about these kind of ideas of eruption, of things piercing through reality and piercing through the membranes that we put ourselves around us. It has that very abject feel of things being tainted. And that comes out of the story of why it's called Bloodborne. Most of the characters and the enemies in this have been infected with a blood-borne disease, which is revealed to be slightly more than a simple disease. But insanity, and again, this idea of legacy and corruption comes into Bloodborne's more Gothic environment. And it is very Gothic. It's almost a parody of Gothic culture in some ways, but it is heavily influenced by Gothic horror, certainly films. And I think Frankenstein, the whale version of Frankenstein, is one of the main ones. That picture, the poster, a modern poster for Frankenstein, could almost be an area of the game. There is a windmill in Bloodborne, and there are areas of wooded forest with spiky, prickly trees and paths which look a bit too clear to perhaps be trusted. But the final game I'm going to talk through, hopefully just in time, is Control, which I think was a bit of an underappreciated game when it first came out at the end of the 2010s, but it is a very good game. In Control, you play a character called Jessie, and she is summoned to a place called the Oldest House, in itself quite an eerie name. But that's a building, a large office building in New York, which is the headquarters of the fictional, I'm assuming, Federal Bureau of Control. Federal Bureau of Control investigates paranormal and preternatural happenings within the United States in a kind of X-Files way. But they themselves have been invaded and taken over by extra-dimensional and sometimes not very well explained entities known as the Hiss. And the Hiss is an interesting baddie because you never actually truly interact with them. The Hiss are at least manifest in this universe as a string of poetry, a kind of mimetic virus that infects humans whenever we hear it and brings them under the control of the Hiss. And the dormant humans who've been infected hang in the office spaces of the Oldest House with this strange red light glowing from their orifices. It's a very eerie, weird environment to be walking around because largely a lot of them don't attack you. Only the militarized figures will come for you. And Control, I think, comes to this third aspect of the Gothic, which is rebellion. There is a lot of the Gothic which you could maybe say is conservative. It deals with legacy and it deals with all these other areas. But that conservatism is often also fought against. And the Gothic is an area where we can try and rebel and work against it. And I think the idea of this game being called Control works to that. There are various controlling elements that try to force Jessie to work towards their aims rather than her aims. And this quote from Burroughs from Naked Lunch, that the control can never be a means to any practical end. It can never be a means to anything but more control. I think that brings up a lot of the game's elements. As you work through it, this control breaks down, and the aims of the Hiss are effectively just to take over. They are a virus in its own way. They want to reinfect this dimension and move on to others. There's no end to it. Even Spencer, Oswald Spencer from Resident Evil, had an aim, may have been a horrible aim, but he had something he wanted to do and he worked towards that. And as you progress through the game, In a similar way to Castlevania and these Metroidvania games, Jessie gains new powers up to the ability to fly, to have telekinesis, to slow down time and things like that. And these powers break within, again, external rules of the game, break this control the game's environment has. So in areas where you can get to somewhere or you were overpowered by enemies, you can use this rebellion against the structures of control to move forward in the game. And I think this game control is about corporate dominance. What happens when a corporation, not necessarily just a company, but the idea of a corporate entity, when it becomes corrupted, when the things it does become strange and unhelpful. And I think that's pictured really by these environments that you work through. It's a very bland, it's this kind of 50s, 60s brutalist office, but strange things start happening to it. This room becomes filled with post-it notes that you never see anybody applying, but that's a weird eruption of chaos in a very static environment. The Bureau itself is meant to be one of the most cutting edge and secret entities in the United States, but they persistently use old technology like cathode ray televisions and vacuum tubes to transmit messages. There are cables coiling everywhere, and it doesn't look as efficient as you might imagine. And that adds a weirdness that I think is quite nice, beyond simply the aesthetic of it. And towards the end of the game, Jessie at least appears to have been demoted. She starts, weirdly, being the director of the Bureau, which is an interesting way to start a game. And then she has to perform these menial tasks like photocopy some papers or deliver some letters. And the way to progress beyond that is, in some ways, to refuse to do those tasks and to break out of the repetition that you've been put into. And that gives this idea, this corporate environment itself becomes haunted in a way. Workers working, doing the same things again and again, stamping the same bits of paper, walking back and forth between the same offices. And these tasks, this work, becomes the haunting element. And so we come to now. And this, now that as I said at the start, I've been now to university and studied philosophy and various things. And I think that we can use these elements of haunted houses and hauntings and games to think about the way that the world works. We could argue that all of these forces that the world is pulled back and forth under are ghosts. We can't see them, and we can't really understand them sometimes, but we can see their effects, and we can see sometimes the people that they manipulate into doing their work for them. And there's Derrida's thought. Derrida is kind of, I don't know, sometimes he comes across as very kind of pompous a lot of the time, but I still think this idea of hauntology, the idea that now is haunted by the past and the future, by things that have happened, things that haven't happened, which will possibly yet happen, comes to the fore in this idea when we're talking about haunting. And there's a quote there, which I think is quite key, from his Spectres of Marx book, that no justice seems possible or thinkable without the principle of some responsibility before the ghosts of those who are not yet born or who are already dead. So if you want to have a good world, a just world, you can't base that on how things are now, but how things once were, how things might be, and all those different possibilities, all those different ghosts, and all those different aspects of haunting. And I think games then are never really just games. They can just be games, they can just be fun. There's nothing wrong with that. But the best games, I think, are fun, but they're also spaces, like Heisinger said, within which special rules obtain, and temporary worlds within the ordinary world. So we can use games to play through, to replay through. And in some ways, games like Bloodborne, the Dark Souls series, that replaying is part of the game, trying different things, seeing why one thing failed and one thing worked. And it lets us work through these what ifs. What happens if we do this? How can we recover from this having happened? How can we do these things? How can we stop these things from happening? And it lets us go through these rooms of our own haunted world and our own nightmare rooms. And if you want to continue, you can insert another coin and play again. Thank you very much. That's the end. We're just over the hour, so I do apologise if you do have to drop off. That's fine. But equally, if you've got any questions, any comments, any criticisms, I'd be very glad to hear them. Thank you very much.